My name's Steve Strauss. I'm a professor in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State University and director of the OSU program for outreach in biotechnology. Along with my co-lead of the lecture series, John Lambrinos of the Department of Horticulture at OSU, it's our pleasure to welcome you to this lecture. This is the third lecture of 4 that we're going to give this year in the 5th year now of the Food for Thought lecture series. The series focuses on biotechnology and related environmental and agricultural issues. It's sponsored by the American Society for Plant Biology, the Weight and Lowest Rising Lectureship Fund of the OSU College of Agricultural Sciences, and the OSU College of Forestry. The next lecture in the series, the last lecture this year, will be on April 15th, when Professor James McWilliams will present a lecture entitled The Future of Sustainable Agriculture. In it, he'll review the history of industrial agriculture and explore ways that agriculture can strike a balance between small farms and big-time agribusiness and global trade in order to provide affordable, plentiful, and sustainable food. So I often read books outside of my scientific field before I go to sleep at night. Sometimes just a paragraph, sometimes a number of pages. However, when I tried to read Dr. Paarlberg's recent book called Starve for Science, I found its message so disturbing that I could not sleep. So I stopped that practice. But I knew that I needed to get him out to Oregon to share his insights in this lecture series. He refused us last year, said he was too busy teaching and traveling, but we persisted, and we're very happy that he was able to come out from Massachusetts this year. Rob Paarlberg received his PhD in government at Harvard and is now the B.F. Johnson Professor of Political Science at Wellesley College and an associate at the Weatherhead Center of Harvard University. He is a member of the Board of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the National Research Council and has consulted for the National Intelligence Council, the USAID, the International Food Policy Research Institute, the World Bank, and the Gates Foundation. He served as a legislative aide in the U.S. Senate and as an officer in the U.S. Naval Intelligence Command. Dr. Paarlberg has published several books on agriculture and related issues. His new book, entitled Food Politics: What Everyone Needs to Know, will be published by Oxford Press in April 2010. In the foreword to Dr. Paarlberg's previous book, already mentioned, Starve for Science: How Biotechnology is Being Kept Out of Africa, Nobel laureates Norman Borlaug and Jimmy Carter wrote, Robert Paarlberg is a leading scholar on the role of science and technology in smallholder agricultural development in Africa. In the early 1990s, he was among the first to sound the alarm about the deadlock between agriculturalists and environmentalists over what constitutes sustainable agriculture in the Third World. The debate has confused, if not paralyzed, many in the international donor community who, afraid of antagonizing powerful environmental lobbying groups, have turned away from supporting science-based agricultural modernization projects. This confusion and paralysis is now most obvious in the case of agricultural biotechnology. Borlaug and Carter end their foreword by stating, responsible biotechnology is not our enemy. Hunger and starvation are. Without adequate food supplies at affordable prices, we cannot expect world health, prosperity, and peace. Please help me in welcoming Rob Paarlberg to Oregon State.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve, for the kind introduction. And I've got to say, it looks like you have a loyal following for this lecture series. Sorry I couldn't be here last year, but better late than never. I'm enjoying my visit to Corvallis. I spent most of the day talking, so I won't go on too long this evening. I'll be eager to get questions and comments from you. Steve mentioned that my 2008 book had a foreword that was co-authored by Jimmy Carter and Norman Borlaug. Both are Nobel Peace Prize winners. I was very pleased when the original Amazon site for the book identified me as the winner of 2 Nobel Peace Prizes. It just proves how much bogus information there is on the internet. This is a lively series of lectures, and I'm going to try to keep it that way. The topic of food is always controversial. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone is ready quickly to spot those who are going in a different direction. For many of you, I might be going in a different direction. But much of the politics of food today, and that's what I work on, is driven by claims, mostly ethical claims, that are based on technical claims. And I'd like to investigate one of those ethical claims tonight. That's the claim that organically grown food is better than conventionally grown food. Plus, the frequently added claim that genetically engineered food, also known pejoratively as Frankenfoods, are worse than conventional foods. I'm going to examine these claims along 3 different technical dimensions. Are these foods more nutritious to eat? Are they safer to eat? And are these foods more or less safe for the natural environment? Those are the 3 dimensions along which I'm going to be, in effect, comparing organic foods to conventional foods, and then genetically engineered foods to conventional foods. And I open with this photograph of a typical farmer in Africa. This is a young girl in southern Niger, because food systems in Africa have now been drawn in to this debate. There's a widely dominant view, particularly among foreign assistance agencies and non-governmental organizations in Europe. There's a dominant view that Africa should embrace organic farming and should stay away from genetically engineered crops. And in my remarks this evening, I'd like to challenge the technical foundation for that advice. So let's start by looking at organically grown crops and understand first what organic foods are. This is a label that refers to how these foods were produced, how the crops in particular were grown. And in order to be certified and labeled organic in the United States, a food must be produced without any synthetic chemicals. No man-made nitrogen fertilizer, for example, no man-made pesticides. Organic farmers have to replace soil nutrients, so in place of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, they spread composted animal manure, or they plant and plow under cover crops, or they plant nitrogen-fixing legumes. There are different ways to provide nitrogen to the soil without using synthetic nitrogen. In place of synthetic pesticides, organic farmers control insects with biological controls. For example, they will apply toxins to insects that are naturally occurring, like pyrethrins from chrysanthemums, or they'll use good insects to eat bad insects. The idea that we should farm this way without any synthesized chemical compounds can be traced back about 100 years to an Austrian philosopher named Rudolf Steiner, who reacted to the first successful synthesis of nitrogen for fertilizers. He was a vitalist. That was a philosophical school of thought that believed living things could not be properly nourished except from the products of other living things, like animal manure. He believed that the chemistry of living things was distinct from the chemistry of non-living things, and he argued that synthetic nitrogen fertilizer was not a proper way to nourish plants, and plants that were grown with synthetic nitrogen would not be a proper way to nourish food consumers. And organic farming remains, to the present day, a farming system based largely on his thinking and on his thinking about what farmers in particular should not use. He labeled organic farming biodynamic farming or life force farming. It wasn't until J.I. Rodale, an American, came up with the word organic that this way of farming got that label. So along the first technical dimension that I'm considering, are organic foods more nutritious than conventional foods? This was what Rudolf Steiner believed. This was his motive for promoting biodynamic farming. And organizations that promote organic foods, like the Organic Center, do produce reports that can credibly demonstrate that organic fruits and vegetables have more vitamin C, they have more vitamin E, and a higher concentration of polyphenols like flavonoids. But nutrition scientists generally reject this as evidence that organic foods are more nutritious, because having more of something is not the same as having a significantly greater amount of something. For example, organic milk from cows raised on grass has 50% more beta-carotene compared to conventional milk. But conventional milk has so little beta-carotene that having 50% more is still an insignificant amount. You would have to drink 100 quarts of such milk to get enough added beta-carotene to equal what you would get from a single medium-sized sweet potato. If you go to the website of the Mayo Clinic, you'll find their judgment on this issue. The Mayo Clinic says that there's no conclusive evidence showing organic food is more nutritious than conventionally grown food. They see no convincing evidence of this. And the British Nutrition Foundation agrees. They say from a nutritional perspective, there's currently not enough evidence to recommend organic foods over conventionally produced foods. This is the scientific consensus among nutritionists. This is a scientific consensus that was recently confirmed just last year in a study published by the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This study, which was commissioned by the British Food Standards Agency, reviewed 162 scientific papers that have been published over the last 50 years on the health and diet benefits of organic food, and they found no evidence of benefit. The director of this study concluded, quote, "Our review indicates there is currently no evidence to support the selection of organic food over conventional food on nutrition grounds." But what about my second technical dimension, which is food safety? Food safety. It's believed by many that organically grown foods must be safer to eat because they will have no synthetic pesticide residues. But again, in the United States at least, the scientific consensus among toxicologists is otherwise. I'm talking about the United States and wealthy countries here. It's very important to realize, and I emphasize this myself in my own research, in developing countries where pesticide use is largely unregulated and where foods are often sold unwashed straight from the field, pesticide residues can be a serious health problem. Even more serious in these countries is the occupational risk that pesticide applicators take, because the chemicals are unregulated, because application is unregulated, because they're usually poorly trained and poorly clothed. It's an occupational hazard and a human health hazard in developing countries in an unregulated environment. But in the United States and in other wealthy countries, pesticide use and pesticide residues on food are both under significant regulation, and the best evidence we have is that pesticide residue risks on non-organic foods are essentially comparable to pesticide residue risks on organic foods. For example, in 2003, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States analyzed several thousand samples of both domestic and imported food, and they found that only 0.4% of the domestic samples had detectable chemical residues that exceeded the regulatory tolerance levels set by toxicologists, and only 0.5% of imported samples were above the limit. And the regulatory tolerance levels are quite strict. They're set to conform with standards established by the United Nations World Health Organization, which establishes a so-called acceptable daily intake, an ADI level, for each separate chemical, and the acceptable levels are actually set at 1/100th of an exposure level that still does not cause toxicity in laboratory animals. So it's a fairly conservative standard. And actual pesticide residue levels in the U.S. diet are well below even these low ADI thresholds. For example, when the Food and Drug Administration surveyed the highest exposures to 38 different chemicals in the diets of various population subgroups in the United States, they found that for 4 of these 38 chemicals, estimated exposures were less than 5% of the ADI level, and for the other 34 chemicals, estimated exposures were at less than 1% of the ADI levels. And remember, the ADI level is 1/100th of a level that is still safe. So for these 34 chemicals, estimated exposures in our diet are currently at 1/10,000th of a level that is still safe. This is what toxicologists conclude. Going back to the Mayo Clinic, are organic foods more safe? Mayo Clinic says some people buy organic foods to limit their exposure to pesticide residues. Most experts agree, however, the amount of pesticides found on fruits and vegetables poses a very small risk. Now, it's certainly true that conventional foods are sometimes unsafe to consume due to contamination. But organically grown foods can also be unsafe to consume due to contamination. In 2006, the bagged fresh spinach that sickened hundreds of Americans and killed 3 people came from a California farm that was using only organic methods. In 2009, the peanut butter that gave salmonella poisoning to hundreds of Americans and killed at least 9 people came from 2 peanut plants, one in Georgia and one in Texas, and both were organically certified. Everyone thinks organic meat is safer, but researchers at the Department of Agriculture recently compared conventional kosher and organic chickens, organically raised chickens, and the conventional chickens had the least contamination. The kosher chickens had the most listeria, and the organic chickens had the most salmonella. But now we come to the third dimension of my comparison. Isn't organically grown food at least better for the environment because there will be less pesticide and fertilizer runoff from organic farms? But here, too, we have to be very careful. I agree that conventional farmers in the United States use far too much nitrogen fertilizer with seriously damaging effects, environmental effects such as the pollution and eutrophication of freshwater rivers and lakes, and even a growing saltwater dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a serious environmental problem caused by excessive nitrogen fertilizer use. But moving all the way over to the organic standard is not a good solution to this problem, because the organic standard doesn't let you use any synthetic nitrogen fertilizer at all. You must use soil fertilization strategies which, if scaled up, would do even more environmental damage. An agronomist from the University of Manitoba, Vaclav Smil, has calculated that synthetic fertilizers currently supply about 40% of all the nitrogen used in agriculture worldwide. If we went 100% organic, and if we had to replace all of that synthetic nitrogen with nitrogen introduced into the soil through organic methods, we would require the manure production of about 7 to 8 billion more cattle. This would be a 5-fold increase in the world's cattle population. In the United States alone, we would have to accept nearly 1 billion more animals. And in a fully organic system, they would have to be either grass-fed, or they would have to be fed on grain that was raised organically, which would require a much larger land area. In order to feed this 1 billion additional animals, the United States would have to plant an additional 2 billion acres of forage crops. That's an area equal to the total land area of the United States, except for Alaska. So scaling up organic may sound like a good idea to reduce excess nitrogen fertilizer use, but the result can be many more cattle and land use changes that will be a net loss to the environment. And of course, one reason the land use changes will be disadvantageous is that for field crops like cereals, yields in organic farming systems are significantly below those of conventional systems. Organically grown cereal crops yield only about 60 to 70% as much per acre, so you need half again as much cropland to produce the same amount of wheat or corn. If Europe tried to feed itself organically, it would need an additional 28 million hectares of cropland, which is an area equal to all the remaining forest cover in France, Germany, Denmark, and Britain combined. So the environmentally sustainable way to address the problem of excess nitrogen use in conventional farming is not to embrace a rigid organic standard which allows zero nitrogen fertilizer. It's instead to embrace an integrated style of farming that would combine expanded use of organic methods and a reduced use of synthetic nitrogen, but not a reduction all the way to zero. The impracticality of scaling up a system based on the organic standard is reflected in the fact that actually in the United States and even in Europe, very little farming is certified organic. Despite more than a decade of rapid growth, currently only about 1.5% of U.S. farmland is under certified organic production. So, summarizing for the moment, I find that none of the technical claims made on behalf of organically grown foods bears up to the evidence. There's no evidence that organically grown foods are more nutritious. There's no evidence that organically grown foods are safer than conventional foods. And when it comes to the environment, if you were to scale up organic production, there would probably be net environmental losses, net ecosystem service losses, because of much larger animal herds around the world, all the greenhouse gases they would emit, and the loss of habitat and the land use changes that all that would require. But now let's turn to genetically engineered foods. Now, to remind you, but if you've been coming to these sessions, I'm sure this is not news. There are many different ways that, that we modify crop plants for food use. Genetic engineering is only one of them. We've been doing it for 10,000 years. Selection breeding is the traditional method. 20th century, we've also used hybridization. Mutagenesis, which is inducing mutations with radiation or with chemicals. Marker-assisted selection techniques. And genetic engineering is only one of these techniques. It's usually used in combination with the others. Several varieties of genetically engineered crops, especially soybean, cotton, and corn, have been grown commercially now for the past 15 years. So we know a little bit about the technology. Currently, genetically engineered crops are being grown in 25 different countries around the world. In the United States in 2007, 91% of all soybeans were genetically engineered, 87% of all cotton, and 73% of all corn, genetically engineered varieties. So what does our 15-year experience with this method of crop modification tell us? The scientific academies that have studied this question have reached something that's close to a scientific consensus. The evidence shows so far, in their view, that the genetically engineered varieties of soybeans or of corn or of cotton are just as safe for the environment and just as safe and nutritious to eat as the conventional varieties of soybeans or corn or cotton. Now, critics of genetically engineered foods, especially in Europe, have been warning us for 15 years now that this was a risky and a dangerous technology. But even scientists in Europe have now reached the consensus that there's no documented evidence of any new risks to human health or the environment from any of the genetically engineered varieties of these crops that have been released so far. This is a list of scientific academies, either European academies or academies located in Europe, or organizations located in Europe, that have endorsed in writing this consensus view that no new risks to human health or the environment from genetically engineered crops approved by regulators so far. This is the European Union. This is the official view of the research director to the European Union, of the French Academy of Sciences, French Academy of Medicine, Royal Society in the UK, British Medical Association, Union of German Academies of Science and Humanities, plus the OECD, the World Health Organization, the International Council for Science, and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Now, when this is presented to critics of genetically engineered crops, their response quite often is, well, absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence. But if you stop and think about that for a second, if you have looked for a new risk from approved genetically engineered crops for 15 years, and if you've failed to find it, that's evidence of something. It may not be proof of absence, but it's evidence of something, and proof of absence is logically impossible anyway. Proving a negative can't be done. Now, critics of genetically engineered crops have been trying for 15 years to puncture this scientific consensus by producing actual evidence of a new harm that's been introduced through this technology. A decade ago, they charged that pollen from genetically engineered corn could kill monarch butterflies. That was studied by the Environmental Protection Agency in actual farm fields, and they concluded that the risk was trivial. Only about 1 in 200,000 monarch caterpillars was killed by the pollen. Then came a charge that a genetically engineered variety of corn called Starlink had produced allergic reactions. This was studied by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and they found that those who had claimed allergic reactions upon being tested were in fact not allergic to the protein in Starlink corn, and they found that those who brought in samples of the food that they claimed had made them allergic, when the samples were tested, none of them contained any Starlink corn or the proteins from Starlink corn. But then came a charge that genetically engineered potatoes had damaging effects on laboratory rats. This charge was investigated by the Royal Society, the Scientific Academy of the UK, and it was dismissed. The experiment was judged to have been improperly designed. Then came a charge. This actually was just 2 years ago in a 2008 study from Austria, that laboratory mice fed genetically engineered corn had lower reproduction rates. This study was reviewed and formally dismissed by the scientific panel on genetically modified crops of the European Union. Now, of course, the charges keep coming. Just 2 weeks ago, the critics of genetically engineered foods in Europe came up with a new charge. They have reanalyzed some Monsanto laboratory rat data on several corn varieties, and they've claimed to have found signs of toxicity. This was amplified by the Huffington Post into a finding of organ failure if you eat genetically engineered foods. But these same critics had made similar charges in a previous scientific paper, and the European Food Safety Agency had concluded that the statistical analysis was flawed. The effects that they'd claimed to have found were entirely consistent with normal background variability. And already the French High Council on Biotechnology and the Food Standards Agency of Australia and New Zealand has drawn the same conclusion about this new paper by the same authors. But what I find interesting is that the scientific consensus on genetically engineered foods goes beyond this finding of no documented evidence of new risks so far. There's actually growing scientific evidence that planting genetically engineered crops in place of conventional crops can provide benefits for the natural environment. Look at 4 benefits in particular. First, corn farmers who plant genetically engineered corn, BT corn, and cotton farmers who plant BT cotton can control insect damage while using fewer insecticide sprays. Reduced applications of insecticides is one environmental benefit from genetically engineered crops. Second, farmers who plant genetically engineered soybeans can control weeds using many fewer and also less toxic herbicide sprays. So reduced application of herbicides in terms of total pounds of active ingredient, and the herbicides used, glyphosate, are less toxic. Third, farmers who grow soybeans can adopt no-till practices which reduce soil erosion and sequester more carbon in the ground, which is good to forestall climate change. And finally, by helping farmers reduce the frequency of pesticide applications and herbicide applications and reducing tillage, there's less requirement for farm machinery to be out in the field going back and forth, so less diesel fuel is burned, so the carbon footprint of this kind of farming shrinks even more. So my review of organic foods versus genetically engineered foods produces an interesting comparison. In terms of nutrition, organic is not more nutritious. Both organic and conventional are comparably nutritious. In terms of safety, organic is not safer. Both organic and conventional are comparably safe. And in terms of the environment, if organic farming were scaled up to replace the conventional farming that's now done in the United States or in Europe, net harm to the environment would go up rather than down. But I'm not just asking you to think again about some of the information you might have received in recent years about organic foods versus genetically engineered foods. I'm asking you also to think about what happens when erroneous information is spread to farmers and governments in the developing world about the kind of agricultural choices they should make. In the book that Steve mentioned in the introduction, at the outset of the talk, I document efforts that activists, particularly in Europe, are making to frighten governments and regulators in Africa away from allowing the planting of genetically engineered crops. And this campaign has been successful. As of today, out of 46 countries in tropical Africa, in all but one country, Burkina Faso, it's not yet legal for farmers to plant any genetically engineered crops. The technology remains under a regulatory blanket. It is not yet legal to plant any of these crops. Burkina Faso 2 years ago finally made it possible for farmers there to plant genetically engineered cotton, an industrial crop, not a food crop. This regulatory blockage on genetically engineered crops could soon become extra costly to small farmers in Africa when the next generation of genetically engineered crops comes out of the developmental pipeline. Currently, genetically engineered maize, cotton, soybeans, designed primarily to benefit commercial farmers in temperate zone countries to allow them to control weeds and pests with fewer chemicals. This is not an ideal application in tropical Africa, but new techniques, new technologies are emerging that would be very exciting in an African environment. For example, crops better able to tolerate drought. This is a photograph from the website of Pioneer DuPont, a biotechnology company that specializes in hybrid maize. This shows the results of a field trial, an experimental hybrid yellow maize plant. The two sets of ears of corn here are genetically identical, except the corn at the top has one gene added that confers drought tolerance. These two sets of corn, this comparison came from corn plants that were grown side by side in the same field experiencing identical drought stress. The corn plant at the top with the added gene tolerated the drought stress much more than the otherwise genetically identical plant at the bottom. Pioneer DuPont is moving this through their developmental pipeline. The Monsanto company also has drought-tolerant crops that are emerging from their developmental process. This is a fuzzy picture taken from their website. Once again, this is a field trial of hybrid yellow maize under drought conditions. The hybrid yellow maize on the right and the hybrid yellow maize on the left are genetically identical, except that the maize on the right has one added gene that confers drought tolerance. You can see, once again, a significant ability to survive moisture stress with this engineering step taken. Now, Monsanto hopes to have this product available for farmers in the United States and Canada in the year 2012, and that will be nice for those farmers. They'll save money if they're irrigating farmers. They'll get a higher yield in a drought year if they're dryland farmers. But they're not the farmers that need this technology the most. The farmers that need crops with yield stability under drought stress the most are small maize farmers in Africa who when drought strikes, they can lose 30 or 40 or 50% of their yield. They have no margin of survival in order to then raise the money they need to buy the food they need for their families. They have to sell off their cooking utensils or their jewelry or even some of their farming equipment and hope that the rain returns the next year. These poor farmers are driven into poverty by drought, and it's there that this technology would provide the greatest benefit. And yet, it's in Africa still illegal for farmers to plant any genetically modified varieties of maize. I hope that when this technology finally becomes available in the United States, its effectiveness will be recognized. Regulatory systems in Africa will adjust to make it possible for farmers in Africa to get access to this sort of benefit. So for Europeans and for North Americans who are already well-fed, in fact, often overfed, accepting genetically engineered crops is not a matter of life or death. But for poor farmers in the developing world in the years ahead, these crops might provide a valuable path to help boost productivity and help those farmers escape poverty. But we'll never know so long as governments in Africa continue to be frightened away from the technology by activist critics spreading unsubstantiated assertions of risks. And at the very least, we should not be telling farmers in Africa that they ought to embrace organic farming. First, it would be preaching to them what we don't practice ourselves. Remember, only 1.5% of American cropland is organic. And in effect, and this is what would bother me, it would be telling farmers in Africa that things are just fine the way they are. They don't really have to change. After all, when you think about it, most poor smallholder farmers in Africa today are already de facto organic. These are farmers that do not use any synthetic nitrogen fertilizer because they can't afford it. They are farmers who do not use any synthetic pesticides. They can't afford it. These are farmers who do not plant any genetically modified seeds because it's illegal. These farmers could be certified organic tomorrow. And yet, being organic hasn't helped them. These are farmers with crop yields only 1/10 as high as in the United States or in Europe. The productivity of their labor is so low that they earn only about $1 a day, and 30% of them are chronically undernourished. So that's not an ethical outcome, yet it's all too often being preached to them by well-fed people in rich countries. Now let me stop there and thank you and ask if you have questions or comments or reactions.